In ancient civilizations from the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC, it is the Egyptians who occupy the limelight for their dazzling sculpture and art, the hieroglyphics they left behind, the royal tombs, and the incredible architecture, including, of course, the pyramids. In the Egypt of those times, merchants traded exquisitely beautiful vases, now known as chimeras. It was said they came from an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, a rich, sweet, and peaceful island, a paradise. The description enticed many Egyptians who wanted to visit. Travelers would change boats in various ports as they moved up the coasts of Lebanon, Cyprus, and the islands of the southern Aegean. One of the first remarkable sights they would encounter was Mount Ida, 8,058 feet high, in the middle of the island of Crete. In the 2nd millennium BC, Crete was the center of a vast domain that encompassed most of the islands in the Aegean. For this reason, the Minoan civilization, named after Minos, the legendary king of Crete, was also called the Aegean civilization. On the south coast of Crete, archaeologists found traces of a Minoan settlement, Aegia Triata. The excavation work unearthed a huge villa and one unusual object among the many relics found. Its painted sides depict a procession. The figures in line are all smiling, serene, and joyful. The object, however, is indisputably a sarcophagus, and the procession, in spite of its apparent happiness, can only be a funeral procession. By studying images and artifacts left by the Minoans, archaeologists discovered that everything on Crete, even a funeral, was related to joy and nature, an ode to life. This contrasted sharply with the seriousness of Egyptian funerals with their rigid cult of the dead. Archaeologists also found these stone vases at Aegia Triata, carved from black steatite, one of antiquity's most beautiful materials. The images on the ancient vases tell us of the world in which they lived. One character, proud and handsome, attracted the attention of scholars who sought to understand who he might be. The solution to the puzzle could not be found in any written histories. The information left to us by ancient historians is imperfect anyway, since it's based on legend and not direct observation. The only narrative we have of Crete and the Minoans is the legendary story of King Minos, whose description matches quite closely with the character depicted on the steatite vase. The resemblance is so strong that many have declared it is, in fact, an image of the king. Perhaps the only Minoan image of Minos that exists is found on this vase. The great legend tells of a monstrous figure, the Minotaur, half man, half bull, born of the union of a white bull with Pasiphae, King Minos's wife. Upon seeing their hideous offspring, the king had the Minotaur locked up in a labyrinth. Every 9 years, Minos would feed 7 young men and women from Athens to the Minotaur. Eventually, Theseus, the son of the king of Athens, decides to kill the Minotaur. On his way, he meets Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, who falls in love with him. Ariadne gives Theseus a ball of silken twine to unspool as he enters the maze so he can find his way out. Theseus kills the Minotaur and escapes the island, taking Ariadne with him. Minos, in a rage, locks up the designer of the maze, Daedalus, but he too escapes, along with his ill-fated son, Icarus, on waxen wings. It would seem then that a dark cloud hangs over the Cretan world. But archaeologists warn us to distrust histories invented by one people to account for their enemies. The legend of the Minotaur was written by the ancient Greeks, and the Greeks were the enemies of the Minoans. The Minoans cannot defend themselves against such accusations. Their writing still remains undecipherable. Their alphabet, the so-called Linear A, is a puzzle, and one of modern archaeology's major challenges lies on a Minoan ceramic disc, the Phaistos disc. When it was found in Phaistos, archaeologists were intrigued by its spiral markings. But unlike the readable glyphs left by the Egyptians, these markings left by the Minoans remain an enigma for modern scholars. In spite of this, the disc reveals something quite extraordinary. The markings are printed, not painted, and each one represents a syllable. The disc thus contains a text, one of the first printed texts in human history, thousands of years before Gutenberg. Toward the end of the 1800s, an English archaeologist, Arthur Evans, found these dusty, interesting seals at an Athens antique market. He discovered that they had come from Crete and decided to dig there at Knossos. He began to discover the remains of elaborate and finely decorated dwellings. The floors of the houses were perfectly stacked, one having collapsed onto the other, as if an earthquake or similar catastrophe had suddenly struck the city. Evans rebuilt everything that could be put back together, but the more he dug, the more he realized how strange the buildings were. The rooms, over 1,500 of them, were all interconnected, as if the whole area had been covered by a single huge palace as big as a city. All around, there were large stone horns and images of bulls. Evans understood that Knossos was an extraordinary city palace unlike any ever seen before, a city labyrinth where the bull was widely venerated. He thus discovered the legendary palace of Minos, the labyrinth of Theseus, and the secret of the Minotaur. Actually, the Minoans, as we see in this fresco, did not have an antagonistic relationship with bulls. They played with them. They didn't kill them. In Crete, they did not practice what today we'd call bullfighting, but rather something called taurokathopsia, a balancing contest on the backs of the massive beasts. In ancient times, the labyrinth city of Knossos was constantly evolving. The architecture would have seemed very different to the Egyptians who might have visited. The roof had openings designed to capture and channel water, but also to allow light to penetrate the interior. Light entered both from above and through openings in the four walls. The structure comprised two units, which were different from one another, but each had floors that were exactly identical. Today, thanks to the excavation work of Evans, we can project what this incredible palace actually looked like. It was a great maze that on the outside featured an intricate interlocking series of stepped terraces. Unlike the Egyptians, whose people lived in mud huts, while mammoth constructions like the pyramids were erected to honor the afterlife, Here was a people who created huge and grandiose structures not for celebrating death, but for living life with joy. The heart of Minoan life, the gathering place for amusement, the place where the events with the bulls were held, was this courtyard. High above, looking down upon all the pageantry, were the royal apartments. The central courtyard contained both the rooms reserved for the royal family and enough outdoor space for the festivals of the citizens of Knossos. It was a democratic setup that allowed the different social classes to mix more readily. The center of Minoan power, the throne room, also looked out onto the courtyard. What is amazing is that the throne room of this ancient city is still intact today, and Minos's original throne is still in its place. This throne, in all its symbolic power, has been copied and now seats the president of the International Court of The Hague. This homage to the Minoan civilization came about thanks to the work of archaeologists who debunked the Greek myth of the Minotaur and restored to Minos his rightful fame as a fair and just king. In the Minoan society, women were equal to men. Today we might say liberated and emancipated. They wore colorful clothes and adorned themselves with precious jewelry. They played an important organizational role in daily life and were the animators of court activities. In fact, one of the most beautiful rooms in the entire city palace of Knossos was dedicated to a woman. Here we make our way through the colorful corridors of the palace to the Queen's chambers. In this apartment, more than anywhere else, one can see just how dearly the Minoans felt about physical well-being and comfort. In addition to festive decorations found everywhere, on the door frames, walls, and ceilings, this set of rooms was characterized by refined sanitary facilities and by double walls to keep the noise out. Statuettes of women lying dormant for thousands of years were brought to light in the Knossos digs. Their clothing is elegant, and in a unique fashion, their breasts were left exposed. This fact incited both curiosity and divergent opinions. Scholars debated whether that was normal wear for Minoan women, or if it was exclusive to certain priestesses linked to a particular cult of worship. The women portrayed with serpents in their hands are certainly priestesses. Their garb is sacral. But the excavations also yielded dozens of paintings where bare-breasted women appear in scenes of daily life. This fact led scholars to believe that this uninhibited mode of dressing was widespread among Minoan women. The belief is also supported by observations of many other Cretan paintings. The Minoans were completely immersed in a benevolent natural environment, as mild as the climate of these latitudes, and one that they fully delighted in. The artifacts unearthed by archaeologists present a new image of the Minoan civilization, not the legendary gloom of a fatal labyrinth, but a lush and joyful Eden. Crete, the home of King Minos and the civilization he began, was the center of a large empire that included hundreds of neighboring islands in the Cyclades, one of the most captivating areas in the world. One island in this group is Santorini, once known as Calliste, literally the most beautiful. The black igneous rock that covers most of Santorini is the ancient residue of a volcano that is still active. The volcano expels a compound that produces a sand particularly well suited to making mortar, and the island has many quarries to extract it. In one of these quarries, remains were found of ancient walls, which immediately attracted archaeologists' attention. Excavations unearthed buildings and relics that had nothing in common with the ancient Greek civilization. After pottery, frescoes, and an entire village were found, a few hypotheses were advanced. It was clear that a tremendous eruption had buried the village with sand and ash, which later solidified. The village, known as Akrotiri, was thus connected to one of the greatest natural disasters in history, the disappearance of half the island of Santorini into the sea in about 1500 BC. The frescoes and the pottery, very similar to those found in Knossos and Phaistos, suggested that Akrotiri was one of the many commercial ports along the routes used by the Minoans in their crossings of the Mediterranean, trading their highly refined products. It was a culturally rich city, worthy of the civilization that we now define as Minoan, and the dwellings are the proof. The houses of Akrotiri had 2 or 3 floors and were built with a light and very elegant style. They all exhibited a great number of openings, allowing air circulation and filling the rooms with light. As in the Cretan palaces, the perimeter walls contained the drain pipes for the sanitary facilities that all discharged into what was an incredible thing for the time, a sewer network. The stairs and floors had a flexibility to them. The attic had wooden beams and a network of reeds and branches, lightweight materials covered with finely packed earth. What is the explanation for such a building technique? The volcano, now and then, caused tremors that shook the island. The houses of Akrotiri were built this way as a sort of elementary but effective anti-seismic system. The Minoans lived in a rich and verdant land. In Crete, abundant water flowed down from Mount Ida to irrigate the fields. They were surrounded and defended by the sea, which they sailed as the uncontested masters. They lived in a society without conflicts. And yet, their civilization suddenly disappeared. Archaeologists wondered how a civilization that had left such significant and impressive traces could have come to ruin so quickly and mysteriously. In putting together pieces of the puzzle, archaeologists realized that a catastrophe like the explosive eruption of Santorini would have disastrous consequences even beyond the island itself. They calculated that the half of the island that sank into the sea would displace an enormous amount of water and generate a tidal wave towering 100 feet or more. Its direction could only have been toward the south, where it would strike Crete and Knossos. As confirmation that the tidal wave really did hit Crete, archaeologists found the remains of boats high on the slopes of Mount Ida. The Santorini volcano not only destroyed half the island and buried Akrotiri in ash, but it also wiped out the famous and powerful Minoan fleet, the loss of which left them exposed and vulnerable to conquest by the Mycenaeans. A civilization nurtured by the sea had been undone by its fury. Discoveries by archaeologists regarding the advanced state and the fate of the Minoan civilization, along with the disappearance of the island of Santorini, have much in common with another enduring mystery. For centuries, scholars have tried to resolve the location of Atlantis, the lost continent. The myth of Atlantis originated with the writings of Plato. It was fabled to be a happy world, experiencing a golden age, an island that was a true natural paradise, enhanced by bold works of hydraulic engineering. At the center of this island, there was an enormous residential complex immersed in a forest. And all of this was swallowed up one day by the sea. Plato had indicated the position of Atlantis was beyond the columns of Hercules, the Rock of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. But he had his information third-hand, citing the sage Solon, who in turn had gotten his news from Egyptian priests. So there are scholars today who strongly believe, given the many similarities with the Minoan world, that the disappearance of Atlantis was none other than the disappearance of the island of Santorini and the sudden decline of the Minoan civilization. What is certain is that archaeologists have found nothing similar to Atlantis or to Knossos or to the Minoan civilization in any of the peoples who came later. The Mycenaeans, ancestors of the Greeks, after subduing the Minoans, created a much coarser, more retrograde civilization, as if humanity had taken a great step backwards. Whether or not the legend of Atlantis was inspired by the Minoans and the Santorini volcano disaster, nothing detracts from the intriguing world that archaeologists have uncovered for us. The incredible artifacts left behind, their respect for the giving nature of the environment, the civility and lifestyle of the Minoans, all suggest that if this civilization had not disappeared, our world today might be a very different place. The Minoans did not get the chance to expand, to pass on the richness of their culture. They were not able to perpetuate their golden age. But what little has remained of their civilization seems to have influenced the world's sense of beauty from generation to generation, down through classical Greece and modern Western civilization. And so today, we can be justified to feel that we are the children of the Cretan world, a world that celebrated the beauty and the value of women, strong ethics as represented by the fair and just King Minos, a civilization to whom a labyrinth was only a game and the stuff of legends, a civilization that seemed to emerge from the Dark Ages and learn to celebrate and live life as it was meant to be lived. During the 4th century BC, Asia Minor, Africa, and the rest of the then known Orient were turned upside down by a military and political earthquake that changed the course of history. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing like it has happened since. The man who brought about this upheaval was the youngest military adventurer of all time, Alexander the Great. Alexander's Macedonian phalanxes swept down on people and cultures like a whirlwind, but not just a military one. The Macedonian conquests created a cultural tornado as well. Alexander brought with him a Greek culture that was adopted, reworked, and transformed by artists from different ethnic backgrounds, who drew inspiration from it and invented a new way of conceiving art. We now attribute this to the period known as Hellenistic. Alexander brought Ionia, the Phoenician region, and Egypt under his control. To the east, he conquered the entire Persian Empire as far as the Indus River. After him, nothing was as it had been before, and Greece, paradoxically, now that its culture had spread everywhere, lost its importance, its central role. Kingdoms sprang up in Egypt, Syria, Macedonia, and at Pergamum in what is now Turkey. These kingdoms signaled the dawn of a new period, the period we know as Hellenism. Of the many art forms involved in this revolution, the one that most clearly shows the change is sculpture. This is the celebrated Hermes of Praxiteles, discovered at Olympia, one of the most important works of art before Alexander. In other words, classic Greek art. Here the artist seeks balance, clean lines, and perfection of form, a harmony based on aesthetic canons that lay down mathematical proportions and are quite independent of reality. This statue is the Cleopatra of Delos. It is from the Hellenistic period, and it is not famous and not particularly valuable. But the mere fact that it is rather commonplace gives us an insight into the artist's mind. He's interested in everyday reality, real people, their traits, their features. We can see the women's fashion of the day, which went for almost see-through fabrics. Rendering draperies this fine was a real test of skill for the Hellenistic sculptor. As Greece expanded its realm throughout the Middle East, its own artists and craftsmen, looking for creative inspiration, were enticed to check out the flourishing cities on the other side of the Aegean. They headed for Ephesus and Pergamum, cities of present-day Turkey. In Ephesus, archaeologists found this frieze, a hunting scene, a wild boar pursued by an officer on horseback. This bas-relief was a source of great puzzlement for them, first because it is usual for Greek art to depict scenes from mythology, and then because of the hunter's clothes. Assembling all the fragments they found, the scholars solved the mystery. The scene was part of the great frieze sculpted in this little temple, which was later rebuilt, the Temple of Hadrian at Ephesus. The stones tell a story in pictures, and by studying them, we can identify the legend from which the sculptor drew his inspiration. Androclus, the son of King Codrus of Athens, learns from the oracle of Apollo that he will be driven out of Athens, and that a fish and a boar will choose a place for him to found a new city. Arriving on the coast of Anatolia, he lights a fire and cooks a fish. A spark starts a fire in the underbrush, and he sees a boar running from it. Androclus chases the boar, and at the exact spot where he kills it, he founds the city of Ephesus. The city we see today dates only from later Roman times, but the streets are the same and laid out with gridiron simplicity, so different from the chaotic nature of streets in Athens. This way of laying out cities was born just south of here in the Hellenistic city of Miletus, the birthplace of the first urban planner to design orderly, regular cities. His name was Hippodamus of Miletus, and his city planning theory spread to other Greek cities, then to the Romans, who built their cities on regular line patterns, and right down to our own city planning in the present day. At Ephesus, the right-angled streets also served to differentiate between neighborhoods. This neighborhood, known as the Slope, was particularly wealthy. The houses have sumptuously decorated interiors. And here, carefully secluded in the side streets, is a bordello, a house of assignations. Like many houses in the city, it was luxurious, with heating facilities and hot and cold water. There is an interesting advertisement on the main street indicating the presence of the bordello close by. A heart, a woman's face, and a foot showing which direction to take. Here we see a great library built around a tomb. Archaeologists had never found anything like this before from the ancient world. A building obviously designed to house thousands of scrolls, and inside it, a sarcophagus. Faced with a unique mix of two totally different buildings, a library and a mausoleum, the scholars set out to discover the reason why. To be buried, as in this case, right in the center of the city, was an honor granted only to someone who deserved to be remembered as a hero. The discovery of a number of inscriptions revealed that the building had been erected by Julius Aquila Ptolemaios in honor and memory of his father Celsus, a senator and magistrate. By building a library in front of his father's tomb, Julius sought to remind his fellow citizens that a man attained heroic status only through the wisdom contained in the thousands of parchment scrolls, the forerunners of our present-day books, that were housed in this amazing library. The Library of Celsus from the 2nd century AD is one of the finest examples of Hellenistic architecture. The central columns are taller than those along the sides, just as the upper columns are shorter than those below. What we see, in fact, is something straight out of the theater. The architect makes his facade leap upward in a surge of movement, and it is this movement, which is foreign to classicism, that is one of the typical characteristics of Hellenistic art. The most famous monument at Ephesus, however, is a colossal work, one that would inspire awe for centuries, the Temple of Artemis. I have seen the gardens of Babylon, the statue of Olympian Zeus, the Colossus of Rhodes, the pyramids of Egypt, the Pharos of Alexandria, and the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. But having seen the Temple of Artemis, which reaches the very clouds, all the other wonders fade before my eyes. Thus, the Greek writer Pausanias described the temple, comparing it with the 6 other wonders of the ancient world. His words sent archaeologists out to track down the Artemisium, but for many years the monument remained a chimera, shrouded in mystery. Many gave up. Byron himself was disappointed by the place. I have beheld the Ephesians' miracle. Its columns strew the wilderness, and dwell the hyena and the jackal in their shade. But time never did completely obliterate the ruins of Ephesus. Though abandoned and neglected, the city has always been recognizable, and scholar after scholar has tried to identify a square or a temple from the base or drum of a column. Not everyone lost heart, like Byron. In 1866, during excavations near this theater, an inscription was found that revealed where the Artemisium lay. Unfortunately, of that wonder of the ancient world, only a single column now remains. The temple, the largest in the Greek world, was over 370 feet long and 175 feet wide, and its columns were nearly 60 feet high. Construction started in 560 BC and lasted almost 100 years with constant restoration. The roofless colonnaded interior housed a primitive statue of Artemis, and the columns of the porch carried reliefs of mythical characters. there were likely a considerable number of votive statuettes. Then, as now, one of the most popular souvenirs from Ephesus was the figure of the goddess, a cult idol. The Romans built their advanced cities in Hellenistic style. A wonderful example is the ruins of Leptis Magna, an archaeological site near Tripoli, Libya. Thanks to the dedicated labors of a succession of archaeological missions, magnificent buildings have been unearthed and rebuilt. We can now admire Hellenistic monuments built 500 years after the time of Alexander the Great. The ruins here show that Hellenism was no momentary fashion trend, here today, gone tomorrow. It has left its indelible mark on all the arts of humankind. The other major Hellenistic city in Ionia was Pergamum. Excavations here at the sanctuary of Asclepius revealed an imposing complex capable of holding vast crowds. They came for the miracle-working waters, waters that could cure terrible diseases. Asclepius was the god of medicine, and it was widely believed that bathing in these miraculous springs, observing a diet based on these waters, could cure any illness. The water here really does have curative properties. On analysis, it has been found to be naturally radioactive and can therefore help cure certain conditions. So the god really did cure people. The faithful gathered in the temple could obtain cures from great physicians of the day, the most famous of all being Galen. His name lives on today in the word pharmacists use to describe traditional, handmade, vegetable-based medications, galenical. Besides the famous sanctuary and temples, Pergamum established itself as the preeminent artistic and intellectual center of Anatolia. It was this city that revolutionized the art of writing through its invention of a new writing surface, parchment. Pergamum, in fact, was the site of one of the largest libraries in the ancient world, comparable in importance only to that of Alexandria. According to a legend recounted by Pliny, King Ptolemy V of Egypt refused to supply papyrus to King Eumenes II of Pergamum in the 2nd century BC, for fear that he would create a library greater than his own. Eumenes therefore resolved to perfect the treatment of sheepskin so that it could be made fine and easy to handle, and as suitable for writing on as papyrus. The result, parchment, made him self-sufficient, and his library eventually surpassed even that of Alexandria. Pergamum also boasted an unusual theater, as tall as it is deep. 80 rows of seats rising over 100 feet up a hillside, so incredibly steep it made the job of building it virtually impossible. Why would they have built something so daring? After archaeologists had excavated the Acropolis, the upper city of Pergamum, it dawned on them that all the most important constructions had been built on a series of overhanging terraces. It is clear from this model of the Acropolis that at the center of this highly dramatized cityscape was the theater. The entire city had been designed to impress the visitor and heighten the splendor of the panorama below. Walking through the city, a perfect example of Hellenism, visitors would have learned a prime lesson of the new Hellenistic culture: shock, surprise, impress. The great altar of Zeus at Pergamum is one of the few wonders of the ancient world we can still admire today in all its beauty. But today, it's not in Pergamum, but at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. I stood there sadly, looking at the magnificent Corinthian capitals, each as tall as a man, the rich bases and other architectural elements, all overgrown and covered with undergrowth and wild figs. Nearby, smoke rose from a lime kiln, into which all the marble blocks that could be hammered into fragments ended up. In these words, in 1865, archaeologist Carl Humann described the day when he reached the Acropolis of Pergamum. For years, the site had lain in total abandonment. The remains of the magnificent buildings were being used as a quarry. The marble was being burned down into lime. One of the greatest treasures of the artistic heritage of mankind was being reduced to dust. Humann and German Kaiser Wilhelm I pressured the Turkish prime minister until Humann was granted permission to excavate. He started to unearth the first of the many marble slabs in high relief. Comparing such slabs with classical accounts, the German scholars confirmed that they had definitely belonged to the Great Altar of Pergamum. 129 slabs carved with figures in high relief, 130 inscriptions, and other statues, friezes, and architectural elements were brought to light and soon were on their way to Berlin. Where these two trees grow today is where the once great altar of Pergamum stood, built by sculptors trained at Pergamum who were the fathers of a new art style. The work of Humann, the Pergamon Museum, and archaeologists allows us to see how this ancient monument would have looked in all its splendor. The building was not tall, under 30 feet in fact, but it made an impressive dramatic impact all the same, mostly because of the sculptures that decorated it. Access to the altar was through a very small staircase, which enhanced the monument's visual impact. The Great Altar was a building unique in its own right. It was not a temple, had no college of custodian priests, and was open to all in every respect. It had also clearly been created with self-glorification in mind. The Pergamines wanted it to celebrate their military prowess. Above the plinth, the Great Altar at Pergamum featured an Ionic colonnade. The monument itself, an original Pergamene invention both in its form and in its decoration, was 117 feet long and 110 feet deep. It was enclosed on 3 sides, while the fourth, which faced west and overlooked the valley, was occupied by the great stairway leading to the center of the colonnade, where the altar itself was located. The altar was considered the most important building in the city. It was constructed at the height of the Hellenistic period, during the time of the Attalid kings, when Pergamum gave its name to one of the 4 Hellenistic kingdoms. Long before Pergamum came under Roman rule, the Pergamenes had defeated the Galatians, a Celtic barbaric tribe who raided the country, sacking and plundering. The altar was built to commemorate the victory of civilization over barbarism. In the inner court, aside from the altar, is a smaller frieze, the so-called Telephus frieze. Here, inside the colonnade, the sculptures tell the story of Telephus, the founding hero of the city, who was the son of Heracles. The Greeks' zeal for self-celebration, already evident in the classic period, was just as strong in the Hellenistic period. But the main story here is told by the larger frieze, surrounding the plinth itself. This frieze is made up of stone slabs 7.5 feet high that once formed a continuous sequence 130 yards long. The frieze tells the story of the battle of gods and giants. The giants, who represent the forces of evil, have attacked Olympus, the home of the gods, the incarnation of good. The metaphor is obvious. This is the war in which the kingdom of Pergamum fought and defeated the barbarians. The Great Freeze was not the work of just one man. Many artists contributed to it, seeking a new way of conceiving art, a new way of glorifying the power and grandeur of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The interaction between the Greek culture of the Macedonians and the non-Greek societies of the old Persian Empire brought us artistic innovation. During this period, artists and architects, poets and philosophers sculpted more than individual statues. They built aesthetic foundations that would last for thousands of years. The culture that resulted, Hellenism, which depicts elan and beauty with such realism, and which exalts human emotion in such grand fashion, has become, for us in the West, the fountainhead of all the arts. The worship of the god Apollo was one of the most popular in the Greek world. The oracles of Apollo were the prophecies the god handed down to believers. Apollo was the voice of Zeus, his father, and his oracles were therefore the will of the supreme god of Olympus. The worship of Apollo was a Greek rite, although a large number of foreigners also came in search of predictions. Even the Romans came to venerate this divinity, since there was widespread belief in the oracles. The worship of Apollo was at its peak in Greece in the 4th century BC. Temples erected in honor of the god were everywhere. 3 of the biggest and most important sanctuaries, which for various reasons had some claim to fame, were the sanctuary on the island of Delos in the Cyclades, the one at Delphi in Phocis, and the one at Didyma near the city of Miletus in Ionia, present-day Turkey. Apart from being the god of prophecy, Apollo was also the god of light and the god of the arts, music in particular. Important music competitions were often held at his sanctuaries. The sanctuary on the island of Delos became so important that it carved out a unique place in history. According to an Athenian edict of the 5th century BC, it was prohibited to be born or to die on this island. Yet Delos was not a desert island, for the city had many magnificent colonnaded streets. And judging from these remains, people used to produce, trade, and live there. So how was it possible that birth and death were banned in a place humming with activity as Delos was? When archaeologists started excavating on the nearby desert islet of Rhenea, they found a big necropolis with thousands of bones and burial artifacts, and the answer to their question. It was there that the people of Delos buried their dead, and where island women gave birth. No one was allowed to be born or die on Delos because the island was considered sacred. It was here, according to legend, that Apollo was born. Not much of the temple to Apollo remains today, but when it was built, it measured 100 by 46 feet. It also had a monumental statue of the god in front that was 26 feet high, higher than the temple itself. Both peasants and monarchs would come before Apollo to see what life had in store for them, a harvest or an imminent war. However, the god could not influence fate, which to the Greeks was already written and inevitable, even for Zeus. To pay homage to Apollo, the Delia, a festival which included athletic competitions and horse races, was held every 5 years all around the sanctuary. Music contests, including performances by numerous Greek singers, would have been a part of this as well. Here you could take lessons from elderly musicians devoted to Apollo. You could learn to play the lyre, learn the metrics of verses. You could also learn how to compose melodies and adapt them to the rhythm of poetry. If you wanted, you could compete with the great winners of the Delian singing contests. In another part of the sanctuary, archaeologists found a concave floor bordered by pavement and surrounded by the walls of an unusually long and narrow temple. When they unearthed this strange building, they called it the Temple of the Bulls, due to the striking metapiece it contained. But its purpose was still a mystery to them. The concave shape of the floor and the length of the temple led scholars to believe the building had been erected to house a great trophy, a ship, or a 165 feet long war trireme. Archaeologists reached that conclusion because for a long time Delos had been the center of the Delian League, a powerful naval alliance formed by the most important Greek cities. Besides, the concave floor would fit the hull of a ship perfectly. The Greek city-states had formed a league to defend its members from the Persian Empire, a powerful and menacing enemy they all feared. Since they wanted to minimize internal rivalries, they chose a neutral place as the seat of their alliance that could be guarantor for all city-states, open to all Greeks at all times. The sacred island of Delos was just right. For a long time, the League's treasure was kept here. Delos was also famous in ancient times for its thriving slave market and its favorable trade position at the center of the main sea lanes. For the tiniest of islands, known originally only for its divinity worship, Delos became a place of grand importance in the Western world. On the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, archaeologists excavating near the sanctuary at Didyma in Ionia, now Turkey, found the remains of two separate temples. The first was imposing and mostly still standing, while the second had only the foundation remaining, and it was turned 30 degrees more toward the north than the first. Historical accounts provided archaeologists with clues as to why. The first temple was erected much earlier, during the 6th century BC, and was later destroyed by the Persians in the war against the Greeks. Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia, and the first king to be called the Great, reconquered the nearby city of Miletus and had a sanctuary built in the same spot in honor of Apollo. Since he did nothing on a small scale, he wanted it to be enormous. And enormous it was. Picture yourself walking up the temple's front stairway, and you'll get a good idea of the building's mammoth size. After the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus and the Heraeon at Samos, the Temple of Apollo at Didyma is the third largest building ever erected in the Greek world. Its columns, whose imposing structure and decoration can be appreciated to this day, were nearly 66 feet high and richly adorned. The colonnade that was erected at the top of the stairway had 3 entrances, 2 small ones on the sides, and a big one in the middle that was always open. Although it was the most inviting entrance, it was prohibited to use it. Only priests could enter this room, called a vestibule. From here, the female prophets of Apollo, in a trance, would utter their responses with incomprehensible words that only the priests could translate. The rest of the crowd of worshippers could use either of the small side entrances to see the rest of the sanctuary. Both led to the same place. After walking through one of the small entrances, one would descend to the ground floor. At the end of a long corridor, you would finally reach the main area of the sanctuary of Didyma, a large laurel grove that grew out of the bare earth and contained a sacred spring. The sanctuary had no roof, so it was bathed in sunlight. In the background, there was a small temple called a Niskos in Greek that contained the statue of Apollo. The god made ambiguous predictions through a medium that was either a priest or a prophetess. Responses were interpreted, and worshippers understood the oracle only after an event had occurred. In this way, the god never made a mistake. According to legend, after the temple of Didyma was rebuilt, the water of the sacred spring, which had dried up because of the plundering and burning by the Persians, started flowing again. The sacred spring and the laurel grove explained the unusual architecture of the impressive building that was mostly roofless and erected on 2 levels with 2 stairways, one to go up and the other to go down. Most of the people would wait outside the temple and try to understand the words interpreted by the priests. Success is achieved only by those who wander around and are able to wait. Worshippers could set off on the sacred road with this knowledge, comforted by the fact that with Apollo's words, they could not fail. The words encouraged them and filled them with self-confidence, making them surer of their own strength. Along the sacred road that led to and from the sanctuary, one would find musicians, inspired by the spiritual nature of the location, who would play their lyres and recite poetry. Almost all singers in ancient times were poets, and most used the lyre to accompany their verses. This instrument was made from tortoiseshell, which formed the resonant body. It had 2 horns and a crossbar on which chords were strung and plucked by a plectrum. In those days, musicians not only had to be good players, they had to be healthy and good-looking as well. It is said that the great Homer was not allowed to take part in a singing contest because he was blind. It was on the Greek mainland where the most renowned center for prophecy in the ancient world was located, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. In early digs, archaeologists excavating at deep layers of the ground found only votive statuary with female guys. Shallower layers contained artifacts from a more recent period, mostly votive statuary clearly with male appearance. Why was there such a big difference? Once again, legend provided scholars with a key for interpreting this. It is said that Gaia, the goddess of the earth, was venerated in an earlier period at Delphi, and that the serpent Python guarded her sanctuary. According to myth, at a certain point, Apollo grew tired of the small island of Delos where he was born, and roamed Greece in search of a suitable place to build a temple worthy of his stature. When he arrived at Delphi, he decided to erect his temple there, but had to take on the serpent Python that was the guardian. Apollo slayed it with his arrows, which is why he is often referred to as Pythian. So once again, legend has been confirmed by archaeology. The votive statues of Gaia, antiquity of the earlier period, demonstrate the existence of a temple dedicated to her, while the votive statues of Apollo prove the change in worship that occurred in the later period, and explains why they were found closer to the surface. Once Apollo settled at Delphi in place of Gaia, he started handing out oracles from his temple. But where and how did the god transmit his mysterious messages to worshippers? Archaeologists found an underground passage under this terrace that housed the temple of Apollo at Delphi. The tunnel led to a hollow with crevices in a rock. Scholars compared this discovery with ancient historical sources and discovered how the rite was performed. After purifying themselves with water from the Castalian spring, Apollo's priestesses, called Pythians, descended into the basement cell. There they were surrounded by intoxicating fumes emanating from a crevice in a rock. Under the psychotropic effect of the fumes, the Pythians uttered mysterious words that the priests translated into oracles, either in prose or verse form. Although this practice might amuse us today, in ancient times even the fate of a kingdom was entrusted to the oracles. A king might decide whether or not to attack, wage war, make peace, fight back, or surrender, based on their predictions. By giving vague answers that could be interpreted in a number of ways, persuading people to act or wait, Apollo's priests ended up influencing the politics of the time. And since they had power, they could be bribed. To have a well-wishing oracle who could help obtain consensus from the people, monarchs and politicians did not mind paying the priests. Greeks believed in the inevitability of fate, and sometimes would ask the Delphic oracle for confirmation of a prophecy heard elsewhere. Knowing that through the priests Apollo could be less ambiguous and give more details about one's future, it would behoove one to make a generous offering so the priests would be more attentive. The oracle did not cure souls nor prepare anyone for the afterlife, but simply handed out predictions that could be translated into real advantages in everyday life. If you offered Apollo a big animal, for example, he might predict you could be successful as a musician. The ancient sacred road that leads to the sanctuary, crammed today with tourists wanting to see the archaeological site, was lined in ancient times with statues and small temples. They were the treasures of Delphi that Greek writer Pausanias from the 2nd century AD described with an abundance of detail. This treasure of the Athenians is the best preserved one. But there were many, all containing valuables and artworks, most of which were carried off over the centuries and never found again. Yet Delphi never fails to amaze. Gold, bronze, and ivory votive objects, and a magnificent sphinx, perhaps the city's most beautiful statue, have been unearthed there. These superb objects, however, were not mentioned in Pausanias's meticulous book entitled Description of Greece. Scholars found the answer to this mystery by examining the disasters that occurred in the area, like earthquakes and the many landslides on the hills at Delphi. Had the gifts offered to Apollo been damaged in the disasters, they could no longer be displayed. That's why people were forced to bury them as offerings inside the sanctuary. So the many masterpieces, already under the ground during Pausanias's time, can now be admired at the local museum. Another beautiful construction not mentioned by Pausanias is this tholos, a splendid circular building. The building had a diameter of approximately 30 feet and was 23 feet high. It wasn't very big, but with its 20 columns outside and 10 inside, it expressed the Greeks' tendency to seek formal perfection. The tholos was an unusual building in classical Greece, and the one at Delphi stood at the top of its class. To worshippers, their images of the power and majesty of the gods was embodied in the beauty of this building. Besides being a place of worship, Delphi also played host to the Pythian Games, one of the 4 great athletic and artistic festivals of ancient Greece. Chariot races were one of the highlights of the festival, as represented by this bronze statue. Drama and music competitions were also held at the festival in this theater, situated beside the Temple of Apollo. If we listen closely, we might hear one of the oracle's predictions calling out to us. Only those who have the courage to face the fiercest battles will receive the greatest rewards. The battles at the Pythian Games included competition in wrestling, running, and throwing, and the event was held every 4 years between the Olympic Games. Winners were awarded crowns of laurel wreaths, the plant worn by Apollo himself, to whom the games were dedicated. Apollo was known for his wisdom and sense of justice. He was the patron of archery and bows and showed great courage even as a child. But he was also the patron of music and the arts, and is often depicted with a lyre. His music was indeed music from the gods, music that seems to echo even today at this majestic site. According to myth, Zeus, the father of Apollo, released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the earth to discover the exact center of the world. They met at Delphi. To the Greeks, this was the navel of the earth, their center of the world. And Apollo was the brilliant god, the god of light and truth, the paragon of male beauty who embodied all the values they held dear, and who could guide them through their lives. It was to Apollo that the Greeks entrusted their future.